Okay, perfect. And then I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and share the PowerPoint with you guys. Oops, that's not what I'm going to do. Okay. So like I said, today we are going to go through mindful eating, intuitive eating, and then also some gentle nutrition. So what I mean by that is we're going to go through each of the three big food groups. So carbs, fats, and proteins, what they are, why they're beneficial, and how we can put them into the power plate, which is what we talked about last week. And we'll kind of go into what I mean by gentle nutrition too. That may be a different or new phrase than what you guys have heard in the past. So we'll go over all of those things. Oops. So if anyone would like to share, and again, you may have never heard this question before, or you may have, but how do you view your relationship with food? So there's a few examples around this slide specifically, but how do you view it? What would you say? If anyone wants to share. So I have, if I pull up the chat box, do you guys see that, or is it just me? Is it just me? Oh, you see it. Okay. Let me see. I don't know if I can change that. Is everyone okay with everyone seeing it? I guess if you're not, speak now. But so stressful. I've gotten 2 stressfuls. I've gotten 1 confusing. Anyone else want to share how their relationship with food, how they view it? Emotional. Yeah, that's a common one. Yep. Anyone else? So we're going to talk about all of these things. And I would say it's very, very common for people to feel stress and emotion around food because 1, it's something we have to do every day, right? And 2, there's so much information out there that it's hard to know what is right, what is wrong. Is this healthy? Is this unhealthy? I'm pretty sure if you Google anything, you will find it. Whether that's, is broccoli poisonous? You'll probably find an article about it, which it's not, by the way. But I think it's really hard to navigate through all of that information. And so my job, hopefully, is to help you navigate through that and feel more confident rather than as stressed out about your relationship with food. Okay. So part of this, what helps a positive relationship with food and shift into more of a confident, positive, almost pleasant relationship with food is mindful eating. And I know we touched on this just a bit last week, but I wanted to make sure that we go into it a little bit deeper this week, and then also talk about how do we mindfully eat? Where do we even start with that? So mindful eating is definitely in that awareness section in the Freedom Wellness packet that I uploaded for you guys. So really here is we want to increase awareness around food and around mealtime, which ultimately leads to increased satisfaction as well, right? So I think we talked about last time about how being full and being satisfied are very different things, right? And we want to make sure that we're not only full, comfortably full, but also really satisfied from our meal. So mindful eating, what this means, being present, having some food freedom, it leads to better relationship with food and also improved health outcomes. So how do we do that, right? So where do you start with mindful eating? I would say the first thing is using the 5 senses, right? So this on the right of the slide here kind of helps you go through each sense to gain a little bit more of a satisfying experience with the food. Also, it helps you slow down, right? And we'll talk about hunger a little bit later and, how we can slow down and productively respond to hunger in a way that we aren't eating super fast. But when we mindfully eat, we slow down, we use our sight, touch, smell, hearing, and taste. Anyone have experience doing this or practicing this before? Not many of you. So it's kind of, when people start it, it's usually a little weird, right? Because you do slow down and you do pay attention. And sometimes you even find out that you don't like a specific food, right? There's foods that maybe like you thought you liked, and maybe it's like kind of to you now. Oh, someone said they've tried this on the Headspace app, which I think I sent out to all of you guys, and there are some mindful eating activities on there, which are really neat. So let's go through this a little bit. So with sight, this is the first thing we notice, right? Does something look good, right? How is the appearance of it, right? The size, the shape, the color, the temperature, even that's kind of into touch a little bit too. The texture. And so this all plays an important role in your initial reaction of the food. So certain words, useful words here, it looks flat, maybe it's crispy, flaky, obviously the color of it. So it can kind of key you in a little bit more there. Touch. So this is the mouth feel. This is the big texture, right? So sometimes you can kind of tell when you're in the mood for something like cold or soft, or you're in the mood for something crunchy or savory, right? Or warm, right? Like I think in the winter for breakfast, I always want warm foods, but in the summer, I kind of like something cooler. Maybe it's a cereal, something like that, right? Smell. So this, again, can increase satisfaction. Odor and taste usually work together to produce that flavor for you. So it can increase satisfaction there. And then of course there's hearing, and then taste is obviously the biggest one here, right? So we really want to be kind of in tune with what sounds good, right? Because that leads to more of that satisfaction, right? If we're always ignoring what sounds good or that craving, then a lot of times we don't satisfy ourselves and we're looking for something after the meal or later on in the day, right? So trying to find what's going to satisfy us, but also be present and mindful by using those different senses. Okay. So any questions about mindful eating before we move on to intuitive eating? Any thoughts, questions, concerns? Okay. Who's heard of intuitive eating before? And if you have, what have you heard about it? Anyone? Yes, listening to your body's cues, excellent. Right? So reconnecting. So I think we talked about dieting last week and how that really disconnects you from your cues, which ultimately makes you less confident in your choices and how your body's feeling. So intuitive eating, really what this does is reconnect you with your body, making you the expert of your body, right? So you feel comfortable feeling those cues, understanding them, and also trusting them, which is a big thing, right? The first thing is usually learning how to feel them and where they are and what they mean. And then there's this whole other journey of learning to trust these cues, right? Because in past, like the dieting world, it kind of puts this negative light on hunger, right? And sometimes the goal is to eradicate hunger, which is not necessarily the goal at all. We want hunger to be our ally. We want to understand it and know how to respond to it. And we'll get more into that in a second. So with intuitive eating, really what this does is it leads to food freedom. Okay, so we're eating without guilt. We're being intentional and aware, but without the judgment piece of what we're choosing to eat and what we're eating. It doesn't talk about food as like good or bad, right? And then there's no meal plan, and there's no like calorie counting. It's more so using the power plate and listening to your body, which again sounds kind of scary, right? Like, how do we do that? How do we learn to listen to our body if there's no rules or guide or like specific strict guidelines? So let's talk about the principles of intuitive eating. So these are two handouts that I'm going to upload for you guys separately versus just the recording. So the one on the left, this one goes over the 10 principles of intuitive eating. And I'm actually also going to share the resource of the intuitive eating workbook and the book for you guys. But it goes through the 10 principles of intuitive eating. First one is rejecting the diet mentality. So kind of like letting go of the yo-yo dieting and some of those fad diets and restrictive diets, and learning how to do that, because that can be kind of a barrier at first, is learning how to do that. Second, it's all about hunger. A lot of people want to understand fullness before they understand hunger, but it's really important to understand hunger first. And we'll go into that in a second. Third is making peace with food. So I think I might have used this example last time, but really, like, not letting yourself like completely eliminate certain foods, but finding a rhythm, finding moderation. Because a lot of times, if we completely eliminate a food, when we have the opportunity to eat that food, you're going to overeat it. You're going to overindulge because that's your one chance to eat it, right? But if we have it in moderation, there's not as much of that drive to overeat it or make us feel physically uncomfortable from it, if that makes sense. 4, challenging the food police. So again, like really feeling like you're the expert of your body and trying to bring out more of the intuitive eating voice and that ally voice. 5 is respecting your fullness. So this is like understanding where that comfortably full or satisfied feeling is. Okay. And again, it starts with hunger, but also learning how to be finished when you're done. Right. And a lot of these build upon each other. Right. So like we just talked about the principle 3, making peace with food. Sometimes it's hard to respect your fullness if this is the only time you get to eat this food. Right? Because you're like, oh, I'm not going to be able to eat this food for a really long time. How am I supposed to stop when I'm comfortably full? Right? So they kind of build upon each other. But if we make peace with food, it allows you to respect that fullness cue a little bit easier. 6 is discovering the satisfaction factor, which is my personal favorite probably, because not only does the food need to be satisfying, but also the experience, right? So, eating at the table rather than eating in your car, and sometimes, we can't always have that eating at the table, but trying to eat at the table for the most part, allowing yourself time, making sure your eating space is clean. I think, the table for some reason is like just a magnet for things. When you come in the house, you put things on the table immediately, but making sure it's clean and pleasant for you. 7, honoring your feelings without using food. And we'll get into emotional eating a little bit today and what that looks like and how do we kind of work around that. But just basically finding other ways to cope with things, right? How do we handle those emotions in more of a supportive way without using food? 8 is respecting your body. So I talk about body respect a lot, and we'll probably reference that several times throughout this course. But learning how to increase those things that respect your body and appreciate your body. And then 9 is movement, feeling the difference. We touched on joyful movement a little bit last time, and we'll talk about exercise in future sessions a little bit more, not so much today. But trying to explore joyful movement and things that you enjoy doing for the most part, rather than like punishing or strictly doing it for burning calories or anything like that. And the last one is gentle nutrition. So we'll talk about this a little bit today, specifically those 3 food groups, the carbs, the fats, and the proteins. But really what this means is when I think of gentle nutrition, I think of something that's sustainable, right? So having a good balance between those nutrient-dense foods, but also having those more indulgent, fun foods. So this is something that you can do forever, right? Because if you completely eliminate things, it's usually very difficult and draining, and you'll usually, it's hard to stick with forever. So we need a good balance of those 2 things. So any questions before I move on? The next one on the right, this handout I'm also going to upload. But any questions about just the general principles of intuitive eating from any of you guys? Or thoughts? Going once? Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about this. And I encourage you guys to maybe sit with this and fill this out as you have time. But this is just a handout that's actually we adapted from the intuitive eating workbook. I think it's from the principle 2 of honoring your hunger, but it's getting to know your cues and your body states a little bit more. So what you do is you go through each one, you kind of understand where you're feeling it typically and how, like, like usually hunger, sometimes we feel that in our stomach, maybe our head. So put where you feel it. And then I like this section. Is it usually pleasant, usually unpleasant, or neutral? Right. So what we learn here is a lot of times like hunger or fullness is not always in the neutral section. It's usually like I find a lot of people are in this unpleasant section, right? Where like people don't register hunger until it's like intense, extreme, uncomfortable. And same thing maybe for fullness. And so we're trying to kind of learn from this a little bit and say, hey, if hunger is always unpleasant, that's probably because you're going too long without eating most of the time, right? And how can we work with that? And if fullness is always unpleasant, then maybe we need to kind of dive in and explore why that's always unpleasant for you, right? And where does that start? And so this will just kind of help you get some more awareness and tune into how your body's feeling on a daily basis. So like I said, I'm going to upload both of these for you in Healthy separately, not just part of the recording, so you can work on them and have them. Okay, so let's go into hunger a little bit more. So I can't remember if I went into the 4 different types of hunger last time. We're going to dive in a little bit more this time. But in terms of the different types of hunger in intuitive eating, there is physical hunger, emotional hunger, taste hunger, and practical hunger. And we are going to go through all 4 today. So physical hunger. Where do you guys typically feel physical hunger? And would you say that it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? What do you know about your relationship with hunger? Anyone care to share about that for me? Couple chats. So stomach, yes, I got an unpleasant. Okay. A couple unpleasants. Okay. Stomach unpleasant. Yeah. Okay. See, I'm getting a lot of unpleasants, right? So this is definitely something that we can kind of work on and explore a little bit more. I got 1 head or 2 heads. Yes. Or actually, you know what? 3 heads. So I notice, sometimes because we want to understand the emergence of hunger rather than, oh my gosh, I'm way too hungry, right? So that emergence of hunger, sometimes I notice I start to feel it in my head. Maybe I'm not as attentive anymore at the task I'm doing. I'm kind of tired. I'm like starting to look at my phone or something. I'm just kind of like out of it. My mood isn't as good. So I start to feel it in my head. And then if it goes a little bit longer, I feel mine more in my stomach. So yeah, everyone's is different too, by the way. But we definitely want it to be more so in that neutral or even pleasant feeling because we're like looking forward to food and eating rather than the unpleasant. Thank you guys for sharing. Okay, so physical hunger. So this obviously comes from the need, you need nourishment, right? You need energy. Again, this can present in several different ways so you can understand it. And this might be like you're starting to feel tired. There might even be mood changes or a little bit more anxiety or stress related to it. Headache, someone said headache. And then increased thoughts about food. This is a big one, right? You're starting to think like, what do I want for lunch? What sounds good? And this is good. I mean, I think starting to think about it is good because again, you can kind of think about what like of the 5 senses, what sounds the best or what am I looking forward to? Someone told me feeling grouchy. Yes. That I think people call that hangry. So people start to feel like, give me food now or else. So yeah, that's definitely a common one. So eating is the only appropriate response to this cue. So as I go through these, eating is an appropriate response for each one. Okay. So even for emotional and taste, and we'll get into those. But eating is the only appropriate cue for this hunger cue. So anything else about physical hunger, maybe that you guys want to learn or have noticed about physical hunger before we move into emotional hunger? Any questions, thoughts, concerns, debates? Okay. So emotional hunger. So this is always an interesting one to talk about. So when we hear emotional hunger, we think bad, right? Emotional eating, bad. And really, it is still under that normalized or like normalized eating umbrella, right? Because it happens. And sometimes it does make us feel good for a period of time. But when it becomes a problem is when it's the only thing that you do to handle emotions, because and it doesn't actually handle the emotion, right? It makes us feel good because that's what food does for that time period, but we still need other things to productively handle those emotions. So what are some other coping mechanisms that you guys have that you would like to share? Got some chats. Creative work, love it. Yes. Good form of self-care. Anyone else? Coping mechanisms. Going for a walk, love it. Oh, two going for a walks, yes. Walking the dogs, I love it. Dog person over here, love it. Anyone else? Talking with someone, yeah. They even say just if you write out a text, because we always want somewhere to direct our energy, right? And so even writing out a text, similar to journaling, right? It helps release some of that emotion or stress, whatever we're feeling. So yeah, definitely using our support systems is always a good one. There was something that I read and it talked about coping mechanisms. And it suggested creating a coping mechanism box, especially for, some of you craftier people, but you can write down like on little cards or whatever, piece of paper, different coping mechanisms. And you can even put eating as one of them in there. But put it in the box, and when you're feeling stressed, picking from there, and it gives you an idea of what to do in that moment. But just having a list even is always a good idea because it helps you think of something in that moment. Because sometimes it's hard to think, clearly when we're feeling that emotion. Thank you. I like that idea. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about emotional hunger. So it says an unmet emotional need that presents itself with a desire to eat food. Okay, and so again, it's not strange for people to have that desire to eat food because we know food makes us feel physically better, mentally better, maybe sometimes, but again, it's usually like a temporary mentally better, right? And then we sometimes feel worse afterwards, but it does make us feel good, right? We like food. So there's no shame in feeling like, oh, that does help me in that moment, right? But again, it doesn't actually handle that emotion. So sometimes the difference between emotional and physical typically and how we can tell the difference is physical kind of emerges, right? You're a little bit hungry, then you can kind of tell you keep getting hungrier and hungrier. It kind of slowly creeps in. Emotional hunger kind of comes on quick, right? It's like this reaction to something that happened or an emotion that happened. So that's kind of how you can distinguish between both of those. Because sometimes it's hard. Like the goal of this is for you to understand and to kind of distinguish between the different hungers so you know how to respond. And a lot of times too, it's for a specific thing, right? So there's something called the apple test that we recommend sometimes. Now, that's unless if you love apples, and this maybe not the right one or example, but just a food that's kind of to you. So if you're feeling like an urge all of a sudden and you ask yourself, does an apple sound good? But not really. It's more of like a specific food that you're craving. Then a lot of times it might be emotional or just like boredom eating, if that makes sense. So someone said, I found that I don't feel hungry, but I'm thinking about food. So does anyone else feel this sometimes? I'm curious. We can kind of talk about that. So sometimes you don't feel physically hungry, but you're thinking about a food. That's actually a great segue into our next hunger. So I got a yes. So people are with you. Yeah, I see a lot of yeses. Awesome. So I think that's perfect for us to go into taste hunger. So maybe this is kind of what you're feeling or just like what you're thinking about. So taste hunger, right? So again, we're not really hungry. We're not physically hungry, but something sounds good, right? So a couple examples I have of this are, restaurant, you ate, you want to see the dessert menu, right? Or say you ate dinner before you go to like a friend or a family member's house, but they have like chips and queso out or chips and dip or something, right? And you're like, that sounds good. I'm going to have a little bit. Again, you're not physically hungry, right? But something sounds good, so you have a little bit. So is eating for taste hunger bad? No. Now what it does is it gives you a choice, right? You have the choice to eat for the taste hunger and satisfy that, or you're like, okay, I'm not going to do that today because I don't need to feel that taste hunger, right? So this is what I meant earlier. With physical hunger, the response is always eating, right? But with taste hunger, you have a choice, and it's not to say that either of those choices is wrong. It's just you kind of understand and you're aware more of that. So you might try something different, right? Or another activity or something. Is that kind of what you're feeling or relating to? If you don't mind answering about who said that.
Yeah.
Feelings.
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think part of it is definitely mm, craving a particular taste or a texture or something.
Yeah.
So I've never heard it described as taste hunger. So that's kind of neat. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Awesome.
and certainly the moderation issue is very it's very easy to fall into the all or nothing
Yeah.
thinking when it comes to that, and does not seem to do much good.
Exactly. Yes. So big thing with taste hunger. If we're always saying that you can't have something, you're going to be thinking about that food. Right. And again, especially if you see that food and someone else is eating it, you're going to be thinking about it for a while. Right. And so you're still going to be searching for satisfaction. So I would say making peace with food kind of helps with understanding the different types of hunger, but also giving yourself grace when it comes to taste hunger. Yeah, perfect. Thanks for sharing. So here's a little bit more about taste hunger. So occurs when you have a taste for a specific food. And I like the second point. It says, when you know better foods are coming, you might not feel the urgency to fulfill every taste hunger you experience. So that's when that really like sinks in of like, okay, I'm taste hungry, but I can have this food when I'm hungry, right? Like, it's not that I like deprive myself of this food, like if I'm thinking about a burger, oh, let me make burgers for my family tomorrow night, right? So like there are ways to it gets better when you kind of make peace and allow those foods, if that makes sense. Okay, we'll move into practical hunger unless anyone else has anything to say about taste hunger. Okay, so practical hunger, I think this one is really important. So it says the importance of practical hunger is to prevent intense hunger later. So this might mean that you have, it's 11 a.m. You have meetings for the next 3 hours or something, right? Or that's your lunch period. And you're not physically hungry, but you know you have to eat something or you're going to be starving later. Uh-oh, someone said they've been booted out twice. Is anyone else having this problem? I don't know why that would be happening. No. Uh-oh. I am not sure why that is happening, Kimberly. I'm sorry. Um, If it happens again, direct message me and I'll try to figure it out. But I'm
It's
sorry about that.
okay. Twice it's happened, but and it could just be the area that I live in. But
Okay.
twice it's happened, and I'm thinking, okay, didn't know if it was happening to anyone else.
I swear I'm
Thank you.
not kicking you out. I swear I'm
No,
not.
it's okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Um, okay, so has anyone heard of practical hunger? Or maybe you're thinking about it and you're like, wow, this makes a lot of sense. And this is probably why I'm starving at certain times of the day. How could practical hunger benefit your life? What do you think? What are some ideas here? And maybe think about like snacks too, right? Like maybe because a lot of times I add a goal of an afternoon snack for a lot of my patients because lunch is at noon and dinner's not until 7 or something, even 8, if it's later, then that's 7 or 8 hours without eating, right? And a lot of people don't have that experience hunger cue around 3 or 4 because they don't usually have a snack at then. But by dinner time, by like 5 or 6, they're starving. They're on that like extreme level hunger, right? And so like I always say, even if you're not really physically hungry at 3 or 4, I'm going to recommend you have a snack every day at that time, because then you won't feel that intense hunger around dinner time. Someone said when they have, yes, so I do this sometimes when I know I'm going to get hungry during training, I'll bring something to eat. Perfect. Yeah. So being prepared, right? Bringing snacks on hand to prevent that intense hunger. Excellent example. Anyone else want to share about practical hunger, what they've learned, or maybe what they want to do with practical hunger? See. Yes. So never hungry in the morning, but I eat something small to prevent hunger while teaching. And I don't have time. What, teachers? You don't have time? Just kidding. Yes. So a lot of people don't have a hunger cue in the morning, or at least a strong hunger cue, right? That's a very common thing. And so, but again, that is another one of my first goals with people is breakfast is important, right? Like getting up, having something. It doesn't always have to be like this big, elaborate thing. But having something so you're not starving by that 11 a.m. or 12 p.m. lunch. Excellent. Yeah, so we already kind of talked about this and how we can add practical hunger, or at least the awareness of practical hunger in our life. So the example that is provided here is eating lunch before a long plane ride, or eating lunch during a set lunch break. So we kind of briefly went over the hunger and fullness scale last time, but I did feel like it was appropriate here just to kind of reconnect with that. So I'm going to show it again. But this is something I encourage, and we'll go over goal setting at the end, but this is something I encourage you guys to think about, especially this hunger piece of where do you lie on the hunger and fullness scale before you're eating your meals, your snacks, like where are you typically, right? And so think about if you're always like at that one, in between 1 and 3, we need to think about that. We need to explore that, right? We typically want to be around that 4 section when we start eating. So there's no like sense of strong urgency, and eating every few hours will help with that, right? So that's kind of why we want to create that structure there. So this is something I just encourage you guys to be mindful about over the next couple of weeks, or next week or so, or maybe the rest of your life. That's a good idea. Okay. So mindful eating exercise, this is something that I encourage you to also practice over the next week. So it says some ideas on how to practice mindful eating are 1, what we just talked about. So journaling your hunger cues throughout the day with times and feelings. So this will give you kind of a trend, right? If you're always starving at lunchtime, we need to think about adding in like a morning snack, right, of some sort. Or maybe sometimes I've had people have 2 afternoon snacks because of their schedule. Okay. Or even sometimes like I'll add an evening snack if people are waking up throughout the night or waking up in the morning super duper hungry. Number 2 says check in halfway through the meal to gauge fullness and satisfaction. So 1, this forces us to slow down, right, and be more present. But 2, it checks in, see where you're at on the hunger and fullness scale and how you're feeling. Again, I want to really emphasize that checking in halfway is not with the goal of stopping, right? This doesn't mean you have to stop anytime soon, actually. It's just checking in and being more aware of how you're feeling in that moment, okay? Number 3 says check in with all the senses. That will help with being more mindful and, of course, satisfaction. And then 4, familiarize yourself with the 10 principles of intuitive eating by practicing 1 each day. That's a lot, but just again, familiarizing yourself with intuitive eating a little bit and learning about it. And we'll continue to reference it as we go each week. Okay, so now we're going to shift a little bit and go into different food groups and talk about gentle nutrition in that way. So kind of more on like being mindful of the power plate and being mindful of how we can include those different food groups in our day. So any other comments, questions, or concerns about mindful eating or intuitive eating? from any of you guys? Okay. So another question, what do you guys know about carbohydrates? Maybe it's something you know, maybe it's something you've heard. I think carbohydrates are the biggest or the most talked about food group right now. So what do you know about carbohydrates and what have you heard? Fuel when working out? Yes. Energy. Exactly. We'll get into that. Primary source of energy. Love it. Yes, yes, yes. Any other thoughts or maybe what you've heard? Has anyone ever told you that like you shouldn't eat carbohydrates, or have you heard that? Whole grain is better. So whole grain, we'll kind of talk about that actually. I'll talk about whole grain. I'll make note of that. Okay, so low carbs, high fat for weight loss. So that's kind of like the fad right now. The like ketogenic or Atkins is what they used to call it, right? And so we'll kind of, yeah, stay away from them, as someone just said. So I'll kind of talk about that a little bit. So carbs, if you guys all remember, it was fat in the 90s that the dieting world loved to talk about, right? And now it's like the complete opposite. The dieting world just wants you to stay with them. But really, carbohydrates are so important. And we'll talk a little bit about whole grains because it's not so much stay away from carbs, because that never works, rarely works, because our body loves it so much and we love it so much, the taste of them, right? And so it's really hard to combat that. But it's more so about like, which ones are we choosing? When are we having them? How are we having them? Stuff like that. So carbs, so again, yes, it is the main source of fuel for the body. Our brain actually solely runs on glucose, which is what carbs turn into in our body. And what if it says, what if you don't have enough carbs? So has anyone ever experienced these feelings before when they try to eliminate carbs or try to eat less carbs? What do you notice when you try to eat less carbs or try to eliminate certain things? If anyone cares to share. Tired. Yes. Sluggish. Absolutely. Definitely. We definitely get a lot of energy. Anyone else want to share what their experience, if they haven't experienced eating lower carb? Digestion issues. Yeah, absolutely. So here you get a lot of fiber. Most of our fiber comes from whole grains, and like legumes, beans, right? So like we get a lot of fiber there, which helps our digestion. And so absolutely, yeah. So you might feel constipated. Okay. So here, I've actually, these like snippets are coming from that Freedom Wellness packet that I uploaded for you guys. So there's a food group list in there. And basically this is helpful because you can kind of plug some of these things into the power plate to make a meal. And so going over the different types of carbohydrates, the whole grains and starchy vegetables, it clarifies in the packet, but the stars right here, or the asterisk, sorry, means that there's some protein in them too. Typically, like your whole grains will have a little bit more protein. Dairy and dairy alternatives, there's a little bit of carbohydrates in there as well. And then of course your fruits will give you some carbohydrates. So this is the like concerning thing, or like the thing that dietitians don't love, is that since people are starting to talk about carbs and how they're bad for you, people all of a sudden don't want to have fruit, right? And they start thinking, oh, I shouldn't have fruit because there's carbs, and that turns into sugar in your body. Which, yeah, I mean, that is what happens. It does turn to sugar, but it is natural sugar. And you got to think about like what you're getting along with that, right? You're getting fiber, antioxidants, vitamins, minerals, right? So you're getting so much nutrition. Yes, you're still getting some of that carbohydrate and that sugar, which is also a good thing. That means you're getting some energy there. So fruit is not bad by any means. But still, it's kind of where we place it and how we're placing it. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, benefits of carbohydrates. It provides energy. It spares the protein. So what this means is that now the protein is able to be used for muscle regrowth and maintaining muscle. okay, instead of being used for energy, right? So a lot of like those low carb or no carb diets, the protein that you're eating is now being used for energy, and your muscles don't get enough love. Okay. And so it spares the protein to be able to be used for muscle regrowth. Prevents muscle breakdown, again, regulates blood glucose levels. So here you'll also notice when you have carbohydrates consistently, so something at typically every meal, then you won't get those crashes. You won't feel super hungry by the next meal, right? And protein and carbs work together to help regulate blood sugar. And we'll talk about protein in a second. There's that healthy digestion, increases satisfaction, and then nourishes gut bacteria and improves performance and mood, for sure. So it helps with mood. Okay. So any other questions about carbohydrates at all before we move into protein? We can talk about it a little bit more at the end too. And any other, like if you ever have questions too, like just more personal questions, you can always message me on Healthy and we can have a conversation specifically about those things. So just know that. Okay, so proteins. So what does everyone know about protein? What do you hear about protein? Maybe it's for yourself. What do you know and feel, and what have you heard about protein in general? Let's see. Repairs and builds muscles. Yep. About 3 to 4 ounces is 1 serving. Yes. Makes you constipated. Yes. Too much will definitely cause that. Yes. Protein powder too. I've noticed people will go in the protein powders and then they're like, whoa. Yeah, all good things, or not constipation, but all, thank you for sharing is what I meant. One more, let's see. So white meats versus red meats. So typically like chicken, fish, they're leaner meats. Red meat does not mean bad. It's just really, we want variety, right? And so red meat typically is higher in saturated fat, but that doesn't mean we want to completely eliminate red meat, because you get a lot of iron from red meat, right? And a lot of times it satisfies something that we crave and we want. So it's finding that moderation. So would I say have red meat every single day? No. But I also wouldn't say have chicken every day and not have other things either. Like having that variety is really good for our gut. Our gut likes variety, and also satisfaction and just getting different nutrients. Red meat cause gout. Well, so that's kind of more of a specific question. No is the basic answer. But I will send a little bit more information about that to you specifically. Let me write myself a note about that though, and I'll give it. Okay. So what happens if we don't feel enough protein? This means we might feel weak. Sometimes we get sick more often. Having enough protein also helps with recovery, so healing wounds, brittle hair, and then prone to more stress factors. So really, and also if we're not having enough protein and our bones aren't getting enough love, our muscles, then our metabolism can be affected in that way too. So, okay. So types of protein. So again, this is all in that packet. But we have animal-based proteins, plant-based proteins, and then you get a little bit from dairy or dairy alternatives as well. So let's talk about, there will be a bigger session on flexitarian later on. But flexitarian, has anyone heard of flexitarian before? So flexitarian way of eating, you can kind of like probably guess it's not vegetarian, but having a mix of both. So having some animal-based proteins, but also mixing in some of those plant-based proteins. And the benefit of this is you still get the benefits of animal-based protein because it is a very bioavailable source of protein, meaning you absorb it very well. But having some of those plant-based proteins in there, one, again, variety, but two, you'll get, they're typically less in saturated fat and they're higher in fiber usually, right? So a lot of good health benefits to including some of those plant-based proteins. So I'm sure you've heard people do like meatless Monday, or just trying to have one meal a week that doesn't have the animal-based protein in it. But there's a lot of research around the positives of that. And like I said, we'll go into that more in a later session with flexitarian way of eating. So benefits of protein, it also provides energy. Oh no, looks like. It aids in muscle and tissue repair, immune function. And, the biggest thing is having a protein at every meal and snack, or trying to have some sort of protein at every meal and snack, will help you feel full longer, right? So if you're just having a carbohydrate, like for a lot of people, fruit for a snack is what they have. And Jennifer Fiske, I don't know if she's on this call today, but she said last week to always, so have or your fruit needs a friend. So trying to pair a protein with that fruit will help you feel full for longer, right? Until the next meal. So it'll help hold you off. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts about proteins in general? And I think, like someone mentioned, the 3 to 4 ounces, and I'm going to show a picture of the power plate at the end. There's a lot. So the reason why I don't necessarily talk about like counting grams or ounces, we can kind of still be mindful of it. But it's anywhere from like 2 to 4 ounces, but there's protein in other parts of your food usually too, right? Whole grains, for example, have some protein in there. So it's not necessarily that you have to have this big piece of meat. It's more so like just making sure you have something there that has protein, right? So like, if you're having like chicken with brown rice and veggies, you have some protein in the brown rice. You obviously have some from the chicken. So just making sure you always have something there with some protein. So you can just be more mindful of that. Okay, what does anyone know about fats or thoughts about fats? Or questions?
Before you should be the bad, like they say that fats are the bad guys. Sometimes you should be.
Yes. So you're saying fats are bad? Is that what you're saying? Or that's what they say?
They used to say you'd say like fats are the bad guys.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, that's what you've heard. Yes. Gotcha. That's kind of what everyone's kind of saying, is that some people will say fats are bad. But we'll talk about like the difference in fats and also how to include fat. So I'm hearing a lot of people say some of the things that I'm already about to say, but there are different types of fats, right? And we'll go into that. Oops. And you do need fats at every meal. So it's not like the main entree, right? But including some fat in your meals will actually, 1, help you feel satisfied. 2, help you absorb some of the vitamins in the food, vitamin A, D, E, and K. And also it just helps with like keeping you full for longer and satisfaction, right? So they are important and you want to include them, but 1, it's the type of fat that you want to include most of the time. And it's usually just like, not like the main entree, right? So we'll kind of talk about this when we get to the power plate a little bit more about how much to include. But it is essential. It's not a bad thing, right? So it's not bad to have fat in your meals. And you'll actually notice too, like typically when you go out to eat, meals are higher in fat because they know how to make their food taste good and make you wanting more, right? But you'll notice that actually when a food is higher in fat, usually means it's higher in calorie, you probably won't eat as much of it, right? Because you get full quicker. So kind of like that intuitive eating, it kind of levels out a little bit, right? Like, whereas if you're eating like at home, a salad or something, or, chicken, rice, and veggies, you might eat a little bit more because you don't get full as quick. But if you're eating a higher fat meal and you're really tuned into that fullness cue, you might not eat as much because you stop sooner. So it kind of evens out, if that makes sense. So different types of fat. So this is what I wanted to include here. So someone mentioned like the good versus the bad. Again, I don't want to necessarily call one bad. It's more so like always and sometimes. Okay. So always the ones in the gray box, avocado, great fat. Well, butter is, sorry, I didn't realize this was categorized like this, but butter is more of a sometimes, but the always would be like the avocado, the oils, nuts and seeds, and those would be the ones that you want to include most of the times. And a lot of times this is done in cooking, right? Like veggies will have some oil on it or some dressing. But then the dairy and animal-based proteins, so you will get some fat here. And another good fat source is fatty fish, like salmon, tuna. You'll get a lot of good positive fats there. Dairy and dairy alternatives, it kind of depends. This is always a question I get is, should I be buying non-fat milk or should I be buying 2% or whole? So this is very, very individualized in how I will answer that. It really depends on one, if you're not getting a lot of fat in your diet for some reason, then yeah, I would say it's okay to buy whole or 2%. But if you're getting like plenty of fats in other areas, then I would say more on the non-fat side. Now, some people hate non-fat. So I would say usually low fat, 1% or 2% is still okay regardless. Now, again, that was kind of a vague answer, but if you ever have a question about this, like you specifically, please let me know, because this is really individualized based on what you and your body needs and what you're doing on a daily basis. Any questions about fat? Okay. I think people always are I always like this little fact is making up 60% of the brain. So our brain really needs fat too. So again, there's no food group that's better than others. I think people always think protein is that food group, but really the other two are just as important as protein, and they work really well together to increase satisfaction overall. Oops, let's go back. So if any, let's keep doing that. Oh, that's why. Okay. So yeah, this kind of goes over gentle nutrition. Again, why we don't want to completely avoid one food group, because they all play a role in how you're feeling, how much you're eating, how satisfied you are. So they're all just as important as each other. Okay. So trying not to have those restrictive rules, more so focusing on the power plate. So we always talk about what can we add to the plate versus what can we take away, right? Because we always think of dieting as what do I need to eliminate? Tell me what to eat, what not to eat, but more so what can I add to my plate today that will increase nutrition, that will increase satisfaction? And that's usually a little bit more motivating and empowering to start there. Okay. So, oops. So anyone like to share what their favorite food group is and maybe how they could pair something with it to make it more balanced? I'll share first. Mine is pasta, 1000%. Could eat pasta forever for the rest of my life. No, every kind, doesn't matter what kind. But with pasta, again, pasta is it's a great nutritious food, and I can add a protein, I can add some veggies or a veggie on the side. So it can, and maybe it's not my full focus or entree again, right? Maybe it's more the side sometimes, but it still gives me those good carbohydrates. So anyone else like to share their favorite?
Yeah, for me it's pasta also.
Yes. Love it.
Yeah.
And
I like to eat with steak.
Steak? Yeah. So have some protein there. Again, it'll help regulate the blood sugar and help you not have that increase in blood, the strong spike in blood sugar. It'll be a little bit more regulated. Good. Anyone else like to share before we move on? I know we're out of time. We're almost finished here. Fruit. Yes, fruit's great. So kind of like what we talked about earlier about your fruit needs a friend, right? So if we have fruit as a snack, trying to include a protein with it, maybe it's pistachios, nuts, peanut butter, with an apple or banana, just always having something there. I love cheese with my fruit. I think cheese is almost second in line to pasta. I love cheese. So here's just a little, kind of going over this again, the power plate. We talked about those different food groups now and how we can put it in to this plate, right? And so just being mindful of that each time we create a meal. So let's spend a couple minutes. I know it's time, so if you have to hop off, I totally understand. But I would like to spend a little bit of goal setting time. So what are I encourage you to think about this and write them down. I know I have that goal sheet in Healthy for you guys, but also if you want to share 1 to 2 goals that maybe you want to work on this next week, and we can kind of talk about it together and encourage each other. So what are you guys thinking as far as goals? And there's just a few examples on the right there for you guys. What's everyone thinking for goals? If you want to share. Allow more time to eat. Big one for mindful eating, right? So like really allow yourself. We typically recommend 30 minutes for meals at least and 15 for snacks. So totally. So allowing more time, allowing that just time for meal time. So making sure you eat snacks between meals. Excellent. Yes. So again, every 3 to 4 hours is when our body likes to eat, but sometimes it could be 2 to 3 hours. You got to find your rhythm there. Don't work while eating. I love that goal. I think that's a hard goal, but I love that goal. So giving yourself that time, identifying hunger level. So being more in tune with the scale. Number 2, yeah, identify type of hunger. Excellent. Planning ahead. Yes. And we'll definitely have a whole session on meal planning and like planning for the week. I think that's the last session. I hope I'm right, but we'll get into that a little bit more and how we can kind of create a sustainable way to plan. Excellent. Okay, those are awesome. So yeah, I encourage you not, 1 to 2 goals, writing them down so you can be intentional about them and check in with them. I think it's next week that I'm going to send a halfway through, just check in with you guys and kind of spend some time going through that sheet that you send me. And I'll send feedback to you guys just to check in halfway and see how you guys are doing and what you're thinking. This doesn't have to be anything crazy, just like, hey, I'm doing great. Any questions? Blah, blah, blah. But that'll be next week. I'll go over it in more detail. But as always, please know that you can send me questions directly or in the community chat or concerns or just like, hey, positives. I love positives. Anything you can send me or the group, either one. And then I will see you guys next Monday. Any other questions for me today or thoughts? Check how to access PowerPoints. So this will be a recording. So you will be able to have access to this in Healthy under Programs, so you can watch it. So it'll be, I think it's on the left side of Healthy, but it'll say Programs and then you can click it. So this one will be uploaded within the next 24 hours for you guys. And then any resources that we talk, I typically will upload them in the chat. So I'm going to send the intuitive eating workbook, and then I think that's it. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for being here today and having great conversation. I appreciate you all, and I will see you next week. Bye, guys. Have a good one.